what if okay? So you're getting out of comics. Did you get all the way out, or did you stick around a little bit?
You know what? I would say that I didn't get all the way out because I was still obsessed with a few particular comics. And what happened was I wanted all the keys, which of course everyone wants. So we're talking now the late 70s. I moved to New York, and I literally had $300 or $400 saved up to buy X-Men #1, Tales to Astonish 27, Avengers 1. Pretty much all the Marvel keys is what I want. I wasn't even focused on a DC. I didn't care about the DC keys at that point, which was odd because I was a DC guy. And I had them all scoped out at this local comic store, and I could have pretty much gotten one of every one. And at that point, I got an offer to be in a band. But it was as a bass player, and I didn't own a bass, and I didn't own a bass amp. So it was either buy all those keys or buy a bass and a bass amp. I was like, chose the bass amp and the bass. So I was definitely still had my desires. They never went away. It was more like I was kind of tracking. I remember specifically I was tracking. Okay, I was tracking because I was thinking as long as Avengers #1 isn't going to cost me more than $300. Fantastic Four #1, maybe $350. Hulk #1, $200. Tales to Astonish 27 was less around then, $150. As long as it was in that vague area, I was feeling like, oh, it's okay. At some point, I'm going to be able to afford it. So I was kind of tracking it up till then. And in terms of the fandom part of it, it wasn't until about 10 years later that I actually happened upon a copy of Tales of Suspense 52, and I said, I've got to get this. And I have the disposable income to do it. And that started me on my second wave of what I call serious collecting. We're talking finding collections in Pennsylvania attics and digging books up and following want ads and actually seriously going out there and doing it.
Where does Creepy come into this in terms of your journey?
Creepy comes in actually around the early 80s when I moved to New York. I had a really good friend who I knew through my rock and roll days. I was in a kind of punk experimental band. So I had this friend who was what I call a serious record collector. So I went over to his house, and he had the first 20 Creepies and the first 20 Eries. And when I saw those, I was it was sort of like a flashback, and I was I hadn't really remembered the visceral feeling of looking at those covers and those Frazetta covers and going, holy cow, this is more than just a comic book. This is something really, significant. So that is kind of what set me off on it. That was kind of around 82, 83. So I'm jumping around a little bit in terms of collecting, but then I actually started to get specifically to try to find those issues and start building up my Creepy and Eerie collection. But it wasn't general comic books. I was just looking for Creepy and Eerie.
When you got into Creepy and Eerie, obviously you've just talked about your reactions to particularly the covers, but what about the experience of the stories? Did they start grabbing you at that point? And if so, what was it that grabbed you about them?
I would say at that point, it really was more the art and the covers. I mean, I would love to say that there was a specific story. I'm thinking if there was, I would have to say the one that resonated probably the most that I do remember from that time was the werewolf from Creepy #1, the Frazetta story. And I think Larry Ivy was the writer, I believe. That one definitely had a kind of hit me deep down, something about that particular story was definitely one. But, I have to say, even beyond that, there wasn't a specific story that, it was much more about the artwork itself inside and the covers, really. That's what kind of it was just a passion thing.
The covers were really, and I think deliberately, atmospheric rather than indicative of a particular story each time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking of the Steranko cover of, I think it's 25, Creepy 25. I hope I'm right about that. I might not be. They've actually got it for sale over here at Heritage. The physical piece is right over there. But yeah, I mean, that was what was. You're right. It was just like inviting you into a world, and you know, there were a few splashes and blurbs on the cover, but sometimes not that many. It was just kind of like, mainly the art was just drawing you in and saying like, almost, I dare you to come in here. Like, this is a world, and you know, like, if you can dare to step in, then you can be part of it. You know, like, that's how I felt about it. So I agree with you 100% on that.
Where did your creepy experience go from that part, where you're back into it, you're pursuing these issues? Yeah. Where did it go from there?
Well, where it went from there was that, you know, in my own personal life journey, career, or whatever you want to call it, I was basically just a rock and roller, and that's all I cared about. But at a certain point, I did have a kind of a background in graphics and design to a certain extent, and art. So I fell into this job at an advertising agency where I was running a stat camera. And for those of your audience who don't know what a stat camera is, it basically is a copier about the size of a Volkswagen bus that does black and white copies, and it turns art into reproducible art. So I ran this camera. It took up a whole room. Now, you know, it's unbelievable that this machine, that's pretty much almost all it could do, is just make a black and white copy for reproduction, making halftones. But anyway, that's kind of how I got into it. And the through line there is my friend who collected Creepy and Eerie was the studio manager, and he hired me to do that, just kind of give me a day job. So anyway, I sort of had this career in advertising and graphics that proceeded on an interesting pace. Like, I actually started to kind of do well in that field, and I got involved in this Absolute Vodka campaign. I ended up being an art director on it, and then a creative director, and I had success on it. So meanwhile, my twin brother was in the television business, so all this kind of winnowed down into a moment in, you know, around 1998, where I formed my own company, which is called Submarine. And then a year or so later, I brought my brother into it, and it was basically, the idea of it was entertainment and advertising. So it was at that point that we were looking for properties, and, you know, one of our partners in Creepy and Eerie was having lunch with Josh and said, whatever happened to Creepy and Eerie? Wouldn't that be an amazing thing to option or do something with, develop? So Josh came back, it's my twin brother, and said, you know, we were talking at lunch about Creepy and Eerie. I was like, holy cow. I was like, I mean, literally like a giant light bulb went off over my head. And I was like, it's like, why couldn't we do this? It was like in a moment of extreme naivete, you know, like, which,
I know, we'll put on a show.
Exactly. It was nutty, but I basically just set off on a kind of personal journey. I think those other guys almost forgot about it, but I just went, and I tried to find out where Jim Warren was, publisher of Creepy, Eerie, Vampirella, all those great Warren publishing titles. And I couldn't get in touch with them, so out of desperation, I literally wrote a letter to the address where Creepy and Eerie was in the magazine, the old magazines, thinking, I don't know if this would work, but it's kind of my last-ditch effort. And then maybe 6 weeks, 2 months later, there's a call on our phone. It's like, there's a Jim Warren on line 1. Something hilarious. Josh is playing a trick on me. Jim Warren on line 1, yeah. So I pick it up. Dan, it's Jim Warren. I'm like, shit, it is Jim Warren. So he called, and he's like, I've done a little investigating about you guys, and I like what I hear, and I'd like you to come down and talk to me. Come see me down at my house outside of Philadelphia. We're like, holy cow. You know, we're being summoned to on high, you know. So that was kind of the start of it, was basically we met with Jim. He kind of gave us a lay of the land. I was actually completely unaware of all the legal machinations that were going on behind the scene, and actually at that point was kind of the height of his lawsuit with Harris, with Stanley Harris. It was about 2001 or about there, and that wasn't settled till 2004. But we were kind of actively negotiating and with him to kind of find a way to develop Creepy and Eerie into a TV show or a movie, but probably more a TV show like Tales from the Crypt. So it basically was a kind of confluence of my, love of something early in life, where all of a sudden, I was at a stage in my life where I was sort of willing to take a little, risks, and naively thought, hey, we can do this. Well, it took 7 years to make that negotiation. So, I forget what the expression is, but maybe it's desperation is the main part of valor.
You acquire Creepy and Eerie, and you make an arrangement through Dark Horse, where we've seen these beautiful Creepy and Eerie archives. We've seen new Creepy and new Eerie. And now we're into a part where you're coming down the stretch on at least the Creepy archives, but you're also starting to do creator-centric books. And could you talk a little bit about some of those that you've done already and what might be coming up?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, those are, if nothing else, they're a labor of love. The publisher of Dark Horse, Mike Richardson, who's just a great guy. He's just a true fan, and he would have the same stories that we all would have going to the newspaper store on the corner, and it's kind of like a situation where you're going to the supermarket to pick dessert. It's all good, it's all delicious. It's just a question of what you're in the mood for and what's the best thing for that occasion. So, as Mike and I were discussing it wasn't too hard to figure out that Bernie Wrightson was going to be the first one. And Mike had been working with Bernie on, is it The City of Others? I might be messing up the title. It was something like that. He was kind of working currently with Dark Horse at that point, and, he was, just thrilled that we were going to do it. So we launched that as a kind of artist, imprint of Creepy. Creepy presents Bernie Wrightson, and that sold really well. It was a nice. We packaged it nicely. It was a hardcover. So from there, we kind of went through, and there are obviously a large number of marquee names in Creepy and Eerie, but they don't necessarily all have that many pages to kind of add up to a collection. But so the next one that we did, I believe, was Corbin, or I might be missing someone in between.
I think
the Corbin was next, and that was an embarrassment of riches, as you know. The thing was, and we priced it at $29.95. I think it should have been $129.95, and I think people still would have bought it. But that was a great piece, and we've done character-centric volumes too. There's characters from Eerie, El Cid. We did Hunter, which are great characters. One thing that actually we are announcing, we've made an agreement with the estate of Bill Dubé for the Rook. So the Rook, there was some question about whether or not it would be included, because they actually have the copyright on the character, and but we worked out a nice relationship with them. So the Rook will be included in all the Eries to come, and there may even be a Rook collection coming up possibly. So I think a lot of people are really interested in the Rook. So it was good. From day one, our goal was to make sure we didn't have to take anything out because of if there were any exceptions, like in Creepy number 32, the rock god Harlan Ellison actually did own the rights to that, so we had to get permission for him to include that in the archives. there's not very many exceptions, but we just anyone that there were, we making sure that it happens.